Have you ever been part of a rebrand that has failed? Did you end up making expensive mistakes and were still not satisfied with the final product? Tell me if the following sounds familiar to you. You were probably arguing with your team for months about your logo, you probably couldn't seem to decide on what color palette said about your brand, and you worried too much about the deliverables without thinking about the message. These are signs that your rebrand is not going well and will likely fail. In this video, I will show you where most rebrands fail and what you can do to avoid making these expensive mistakes. Hi, I'm Rebrands, a designer and brand strategist. I help companies like yours avoid wasting money on a rebrand so you only attract your ideal customers. In order to help you avoid making expensive mistakes, let's have a look at some of the reasons why rebrands fail. I often find that one of the reasons is that leadership is not aligned with what the company stands for. Since most of the time strategy flows from top to bottom, in other words from leadership all the way to the entire team, this is one of the major bottlenecks. I like to think of a brand as follows. When your company looks at itself in a mirror, what is reflected back is your brand. Your brand is a collection of experiences that everybody interacting with your company has. As a result, the company culture is integral to your brand. When leadership sets the tone of your culture, your team has to deliver that message to your customers and to the entire market. If leadership doesn't understand or is unable to communicate your company culture and what it stands for, then the entire team is working blind. Which leads me to my next point. There is no agreement on who the brand is for or whom it is not for. Your brand is not for everybody. You have to understand this. In the same way that Coca-Cola is not for everybody. Coca-Cola is for the people that on a daily basis consume 1.7 to 1.9 billion servings of their product. You know who Coca-Cola isn't for? The other 1 billion servings of Pepsi that are consumed every day by Pepsi's customers. So Coca-Cola isn't for everybody. It's not for Pepsi drinkers. In the same vein, Apple is not for everybody. Apple is for people who think different. It's not for Microsoft users and it's not for Android users. Likewise, your company is not for everybody. And this is where company leaders waste the most amount of money and they make the most expensive mistakes communicating with people that are not their customers. A lot of money gets wasted because the messaging, the branding, the marketing is done for people who will not be your customers. To avoid making any of these mistakes, you have to be very target specific with your ideal client profile. Stop spraying and praying and hoping that your message gets across to everyone because it's not supposed to. If you're unable to identify your ideal customer profile, you're going to be dead in the water and just wasting budget. Which brings me to the last point, and that is that decisions are made by consensus instead of criteria. What do I mean by this? When you're creating your targeting criteria, you have to know who your ideal customer profile is. If at the last step you didn't identify who you want to message to, then you don't have a criteria or a foundation from where to start your messaging, your branding, or any other activities relating to marketing. As a result, decisions are made by consensus. In other words, we're going to have wide team meetings where everybody's opinion counts about things such as our typography, our logo, our color palette. But if we haven't established who we're communicating to, all of this is just a waste of money and time. And since we don't know what the criteria is and we've wasted so much time talking about deliverables, we end up in a situation where we blame design. In other words, design just becomes the visible place where unresolved strategy shows up. If you don't have a strategy, you're wasting design. Now, design matters. I'm a designer and brand strategist. I understand where design comes in handy. Design is a tool. It is not the end result. When you do a rebrand, you're not paying for a lovely logo or a brand idea, although all of these things are part of the brand process. What design and other creative services offer is a roadmap that will help you message and communicate with your ideal customers. What you're really conflicted about is your identity, be it graphical, visual, or strategic. However, if your brand's foundation is unclear, then no amount of creative work can fix it. No amount of budgets or money thrown at design can fix it. It'll just make the confusion that much more expensive. Now, what can you do to not waste money on your rebrand and make sure that you're creating a solid foundation which will target your ideal customers? The three-part framework that I use is the following. Now, every single part has more steps, but I just want to first introduce it. There's the discovery phase, the creative phase, and the implementation phase. In the discovery phase, this is where we talk about what and who. In other words, what are we going to do and who are we going to target? The creative phase is the how we go about doing it, whether it's a brand identity, other deliverables, a commercial shoot, etc. And implementation phase is where we launch your new brand, rebrand, or whatever other changes or creative we have made along the way. Let's now look at the discovery phase. This is where we find out what's really going on. In the discovery phase, the important steps are looking at and studying your current brand positioning, who are we talking to, and fixing touch points. Many people tend to rush over the discovery phase, thinking it's just some formality they have to get out of the way and rush to the creative process. And I understand this feeling. Again, I'm a designer. I love the creative part and I want to get stuck in as soon as possible. But this is a crucial mistake that many people do. They don't spend enough time in the discovery phase. This is foundational work. It is the most important part of a rebrand or a brand in general. This is where you look at where you're currently positioned with your brand, if you have one, obviously. And also, this is the point where we talk about your ICP, your ideal client profile, and the antagonist or ideal enemy, the people that we don't want to target with the rebrand and we don't want to waste any money communicating to them. When you take the time to properly evaluate who your ideal client is, what their avatar is, find out as much as you can about them and kind of just simulate who this person or people are, you're no longer going to work at creative blindly. You're going to have a very targeted profile that you can concentrate all your energies on. Now, I have another video, if it hasn't already been launched, where I talk about the ideal client profile and the antagonist to that ideal client profile. In other words, the ideal enemy. That's where I go in and look in more detail about how you come about creating an ideal client profile, and also one for the ideal enemy, so you make sure you're avoiding any messaging that does not target specifically your ICP. All of this to say that the final part of the discovery phase is to fix the touch points. We have to figure out where, if things have to change. In other words, do you actually need a rebrand? We might find out that your brand identity is sufficient to target the people or the avatar that we want to target, or the market that you want to enter, or the products that you want to sell. You might find out that your logo, your colors, all of the brand identity, the visuals are perfectly fine. So why would you spend time or resources starting from scratch or going in a different direction? But of course, this is all in the discovery phase. You can't make company-wide changes if you haven't gone through a proper discovery phase and itemize every touch point to see what needs to be modified. This could be your visual brand identity. This could be maybe your team culture. This could be the touch points that the customers interface with. You have to itemize this list and see if changes need to be made so that, again, your messaging aligns with who you are trying to target. Perhaps it's just an internal change. Maybe your team doesn't know how to message, or maybe leadership is just not quite there with the messaging, even though the visual brand identity is totally fine. So that's why all of this work is done before we even start thinking about design or creative, because if we haven't done it, we go straight to wasting money on visuals, creative, animations, logos, etc. that may or may not take into account what has been discovered, what has been evaluated as foundational work versus simply creative. So that's why this answers why rebrands fail before design even starts, is because most people do not spend the necessary time at the discovery phase, because this is foundational. This is what makes sure you're not wasting money or throwing it down the drain on inefficient rebrands. The next step in the framework is part 2, the creative phase. This is where we turn the strategy into something that people can see, hear, or interact with. The creative phase is also where we take care of the visual communication and the design system that match where the brand is going. Now, I love this phase because obviously I'm a creative, I'm a designer, so I can't wait to get stuck in. However, I would be doing you a great disservice if I just rushed to this part. All that work that we did in the first part, the discovery phase, has to get applied. And if I rush that part and just jump in straight to the creative phase, then that wouldn't be very good for the overall result, which may lead to failure of the entire rebrand. So in order to combat that, we use the agreed upon rules and goals to guideline the choices that we're going to make at the creative part. That entire foundational work that we did in the phase 1 of discovery has to get applied here. I'm not going to just start designing randomly logos or offering different typography options or color palettes without knowing which touch points that we evaluated in the first part. Knowing those touch points, there's not going to be any wasted time or resources designing things that don't have any relevance to the foundational work we did in the discovery phase. And this is also the part where we talk about the areas that need work and fix before they become expensive in the launch phase. Any branding work that can be done here, any of the creatives that are lacking that we figured out in the first phase, we can do now while it's still relatively inexpensive. Last thing you want to do is to launch the brand, your packaging, your signage, or anything of that matter, and notice that mistakes were made, and then it's really expensive. So the creative phase should address that issue and make sure that nothing goes out that has any mistakes or that haven't been addressed. This is the fun part of the entire rebrand. That's where our creative reward, if you will, is demonstrated and it comes out. However, again, it is not the most critical phase. If phase 1 was not done correctly, creative part in phase 2 is not going to help the situation. And then phase 3 is the final phase, and that is, of course, implementation. This is essentially where we launch your brand. It's launch day, it's the big explosion, it's the big reveal, if you will. There are a few key critical aspects that do need to be taken into consideration. For one, everyone knows what's changing and understands how we use the brand effectively. Before we launch, the entire team, the entire company has to know the new direction that we're going into. That means everybody has gotten the communications necessary so that they can distribute that efficiently to the customers, to the market, to all the touch points. That's where we also share tools across all teams, guidelines, templates, etc. This is where the brand identity kit or the brand book comes into. Not only that, everybody gets access to all the resources. Otherwise, what's the point of the entire exercise? People need to know how to apply the brand, where it needs to go, and how it should look across all borders and across all touch points. And of course, the final is the actual rollout, and that's where you update all customer-facing touch points, be it on your website, your logo, your signage, your packaging, everything. And of course, finally, if all went well, we breathe a sigh of relief having avoided expensive mistakes and correctly aligned your messaging. This is the big payout. Because we spent so much time on foundation work, because you knew where not to make the mistakes, not to rush into the design process, because you've done all these steps, you can rest assured that everything was done in accordance with a well thought out plan to target your specific ICPs and got the entire team from leadership all the way down onto the same messaging. And again, all this was done before design ever started. So if you've gone through this exact framework with your creative agency, you have reduced tremendously the chances that your rebrand will fail, and you will be aligned correctly with your messaging towards your customers and your entire market. If you've gotten value out of this video, please share it with somebody else that you think might be interested in it. Give it a like, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. And also look out for that video where I talk about the ICP and your ideal enemy.